Italy is finally saying no more, slamming its front door on the boats crossing from North Africa's Muslim-majority coast while quietly propping the back door open for workers it can't live without. In 2023, 157,000 migrants landed on its shores. That February, 94 drowned off Cutro. By 2024, Rome was shipping asylum seekers to camps in Albania instead. Giorgia Meloni promised a naval blockade. Yet her aging economy still needs hundreds of thousands of foreign hands just to keep running. Can Italy shut the door and survive? That question starts with the politician who asked voters to trust her with the answer. Giorgia Meloni built her rise to the prime ministership on a promise to control migration that her predecessors had failed to deliver, culminating in her explicit vow of a naval blockade to stop boats before they ever left North African waters. That promise won her the argument at home. It never touched the water it was supposed to patrol because international maritime law and the reality of Libya's coastline made an actual blockade impossible to execute, leaving the demand for tighter borders running far ahead of any tool capable of enforcing it. That gap starts with a map, not a policy paper. Italy doesn't choose to sit on Europe's front porch on the Mediterranean. Geography decided that long before any minister took office. Lampedusa, the southernmost scrap of Italian territory, sits barely 113 kilometers, about 70 miles, from the Tunisian coast. Sicily, the nearest major piece of the Italian mainland, sits 205 kilometers away. For anyone leaving North Africa by boat, Lampedusa isn't the edge of Europe. It's simply the closest possible landfall, which is exactly why smugglers point their overloaded dinghies toward it. That closest landfall is also one of the smallest inhabited places in the country. Roughly 6,000 people live on Lampedusa year-round, running its fishing boats, its handful of hotels, its single hospital. In a single 3-day span in September 2023, more than 8,500 migrants came ashore there, briefly outnumbering the island's own residents. The reception center, built to hold a few hundred people at a time, filled and overflowed onto the docks and roadside. A doorstep that small was never built to absorb a crowd that large. That doorstep crisis scaled into a national one by the time the year closed its books. Italy recorded 157,651 sea arrivals in 2023, the highest total since 2016's 181,436. Under the EU's Dublin regulation, the country where a migrant first sets foot carries the initial legal duty to process that person's asylum claim. Geography had already made that country Italy. The Dublin rule simply wrote geography into law, leaving Italy holding a national workload that other, less exposed EU members never had to carry at the same scale. That imbalance bred a specific political grievance in Rome, repeated at nearly every EU summit. Frontline states like Italy processed the overwhelming majority of new arrivals while governments further north, insulated by geography, faced a fraction of the same pressure. Demands for a European solution to a Mediterranean problem became a recurring plea long before Meloni took office, which is part of why her promise to handle it unilaterally landed so well with voters exhausted by asking Brussels for help that arrived late, if at all. That legal workload arrived with a specific human texture. Large numbers of the people crossing came from Muslim-majority states across North and West Africa and South Asia, which meant every asylum claim Italy processed was also, quietly, a question about who would eventually live in Italian towns, pray in Italian cities, and raise children as new Italians. From that first summer of record arrivals onward, migration policy became immediately and permanently a debate about religion, integration, and national identity that no single decree could settle. None of that framing prepared the country for what happened off Calabria 5 months earlier, before the year's arrival numbers had even started climbing. On February 26, 2023, a wooden boat carrying roughly 180 people, mostly Afghan and Pakistani migrants, broke apart in rough seas within sight of the shore at Staccato de Cutro. It went down close enough that people on the beach could see it happening. At least 94 people died. Children were among them, and bodies washed up on the same stretch of coastline that tourists use every summer. Those deaths, so visibly close to land, were impossible to file away as a distant tragedy. The country reacted with fury, and opposition politicians openly called for Interior Minister Matteo Piantedosi to resign over how patrol boats and rescue coordination had handled the warning signs before the wreck. The front door had just proven it could kill people trying to walk through it. Meloni's government answered that grief with legislation rather than resignation, moving fast enough that the timing itself became part of the controversy. 3 weeks after the wreck came the Cutro Decree of March 2023, narrowing who qualified for the Humanitarian Special Protection Residency Permit, a status that had previously covered people who didn't meet the technical bar for refugee status but couldn't safely be sent home either. The decree also sped up expulsions for those who no longer qualified. It carried the name of the tragedy that had just filled the front pages, which critics called tone deaf, a law making protection harder to get, passed weeks after dozens died trying to reach exactly that protection. The decree's underlying logic was deterrence, make the legal landing softer to fall into, and fewer people will risk the crossing. The numbers didn't cooperate. 2023 still closed with that record 157,651 arrivals, proof that a law passed in anger in Rome doesn't automatically change a calculation made in desperation on a beach in Libya or Tunisia, where the decision to board a boat has almost nothing to do with Italian residency statutes. Rights groups and the UN Refugee Agency criticized the timing and substance of the decree, arguing it punished survivors of the same danger it claimed to be preventing. Applications for special protection, once a meaningful path to stay, narrowed almost overnight into a far smaller category, pushing more people who couldn't be deported into years of legal limbo instead of off the books entirely. Unable to slow the boats with domestic law alone, Rome looked for somewhere else to put the problem, moving the argument from Italian courtrooms to international ones. In November 2023, Italy signed a protocol with Albania to process up to 3,000 migrants a month at 2 new facilities at Schengen and Zadar on Albanian soil but under Italian jurisdiction. If people couldn't be stopped from leaving North Africa, the thinking went, they could at least be processed somewhere that wasn't technically Italy, easing pressure on Lampedusa and the mainland reception system. The camps finally opened in October 2024, nearly a year after the deal was signed, a delay that already signaled how complicated the plan was to execute. Days later, Italian judges refused to validate the detentions held there, citing EU rules on which countries could legally be labeled safe for return, meaning several of the men sent to Albania had to be brought straight back to Italy almost as soon as they arrived. Outsourcing the front door to another country hadn't put Italian courts out of the loop, it had just given them a longer commute. The blocked detentions didn't send the migrants home either. Under EU rules, once removed from the offshore process, they had to be transferred into Italy's ordinary reception system instead, meaning the maneuver Rome designed to reduce its domestic caseload kept adding back to it every time a court intervened. Losing in court once wasn't enough to make Meloni's government abandon the Albania model. It elevated its own safe country list into primary national legislation, an attempt to bind the judges who kept striking the detentions down by force of statute rather than persuasion. The judges responded by referring the underlying question to the European Court of Justice instead of complying with the new statute. Rulings through 2024 and 2025 kept narrowing which countries Italy could actually call safe, chipping away at the legal foundation the Albania plan depended on. A national law had run straight into the ceiling of EU law, and Rome discovered that its front door hinges were ultimately controlled from Brussels, not from Rome. Those hinges in Brussels weren't the only ones nobody had properly inspected. While the boats and courtroom fights dominated headlines, a quieter gap sat inside Italy's own borders, one that had nothing to do with the sea. More than 2.2 million Muslims live in the country, roughly 3.7% of the population, a community built up over decades of settled migration, marriage, and second-generation children born as Italian citizens. For a community that size, official infrastructure barely exists. Fewer than 10 mosques nationwide hold full official recognition, leaving most worshippers praying in converted garages, warehouses, and rented storefronts that carry no formal religious status at all. A population measured in the millions, with almost nowhere sanctioned to gather for Friday prayers, was its own kind of unresolved door, one Italy had simply never gotten around to building. That failure carries its own risk. Unofficial prayer rooms don't come with the oversight that recognized mosques do. No license to track who runs them, no formal channel connecting community leaders to local government, no infrastructure for the state to actually engage with before frustration curdles into something worse. The same absence that looked like a zoning failure in daylight would resurface later as a security argument after dark. That same absence of oversight is what Lombardy formalized into policy, the clearest example of how the door stayed shut without anyone ever having to formally close it. Its 2015 regional law imposed strict parking and building requirements on new religious structures, so demanding that few informal prayer spaces could ever convert into legally recognized mosques. Nothing in the text mentioned religion, let alone Islam by name, but the effect was the same as an outright ban, just harder to challenge in court because the law never had to justify itself on religious grounds. Paperwork did quietly what a headline policy would have done loudly. Some towns skipped that subtlety entirely. Several Lega-run municipalities, including Novara, passed local ordinances restricting face coverings inside public buildings, rules aimed squarely at visible markers of Muslim practice rather than at zoning technicalities. Behind those local fights sits a bigger structural gap nobody in Rome has closed. Italy has never signed an intesa, the formal recognition accord it already holds with the Catholic Church and several smaller faiths, with any national Islamic body. Without that agreement, mosque access and religious practice rules vary town by town, so Italy ended up governing millions of people's faith through a patchwork of city halls instead of one federal standard. The result is uneven citizenship in practice, if not in law. A Muslim family's ability to build a mosque, wear religious dress in public buildings, or find a recognized cleric to conduct a funeral can depend entirely on which mayor happens to be in office, a level of variation Italy has never tolerated for its Catholic majority and rarely discusses openly when the subject is Islam. That silence didn't last long once security, rather than zoning, became the stated concern. Italy's Interior Ministry has used Article 3 of Decree Law 144 from 2005 to expel foreign nationals, including imams, flagged as terrorism risks, a power written into law 2 decades ago and increasingly reached for as radicalization fears grew alongside the mosque shortage. Piantedosi has publicly pointed to these security-based expulsions as a tool against radicalization, arguing that waiting for a criminal case to build is too slow when the risk involves someone preaching to a congregation every week. What makes them different from an ordinary criminal case is that they bypass trial entirely, an administrative order signed by the ministry, not a verdict reached by a judge weighing evidence. That draws criticism from civil liberties groups and Muslim community organizations who watch a religious posting get treated like a conviction with no courtroom, no defense, no appeal process built to match. The front door was now swinging shut on people who were already living inside the house. These aren't isolated cases. Since the powers were introduced in 2005, they've become a recurring instrument, invoked whenever intelligence services flag a preacher's rhetoric as dangerous rather than merely controversial, and each expulsion order draws the same argument on repeat: swift removal from the country versus the presumption of innocence that any other resident accused of a crime would receive. Then the same government that kept tightening the front door threw the back one wide open, without much fanfare. In September 2023, Meloni's government set a non-EU labor quota of roughly 452,000 workers for 2023 through 2025, one of the largest such quotas Italy has issued in years, even as the Cutro Decree and the Albania camps were dominating the news cycle. The sectors asking for those workers tell their own story about who Italy actually needs: agriculture, tourism, elder caregiving, and construction. The jobs that keep food on shelves, hotels staffed, and aging relatives cared for at home. Italians call the caregiving role badanti, the workers who let families keep parents and grandparents out of institutions, and the domestic labor pool simply cannot supply enough people willing to do that work at the wages offered. The reason is demographic, not political, and it explains why no amount of border toughness can make the quota disappear. Italy's fertility rate sits around 1.2 to 1.24 children per woman, among the lowest in Europe. And without immigration, the population is projected to fall from roughly 59 million toward 55 million by 2050. The same government drafting expulsion orders for imams was also signing hundreds of thousands of new work permits for laborers, because an aging country cannot police its way out of needing hands, no matter which door those hands walk through. That single fact reframes everything that came before it. A government that spent 2023 narrowing humanitarian protections, blocking asylum processing offshore, and expelling religious leaders by administrative order spent that same window quietly recruiting the very same demographic pool it kept publicly restricting, just through a different door with a different name on the paperwork. That contradiction didn't stay a purely Italian problem for long. It got folded into a continent-wide deal built to manage exactly this tension. The EU Pact on Migration and Asylum was formally adopted in April 2024, with phased application beginning in June 2026, including a mandatory solidarity mechanism meant to spread the weight that Dublin had piled onto frontline states like Italy. Under that mechanism, member states must either accept relocated migrants or pay roughly €20,000 per rejected relocation into a shared fund, turning solidarity into something with an actual price tag. Italy pushed hard during negotiations for the externalization-style provisions that let it keep processing arrivals outside its own borders, the same instinct that had produced the Albania camps in the first place. Rome's front door was becoming a European front door, with Brussels now holding a spare key to a house it didn't fully control. Not every EU member welcomed that arrangement. Countries with little coastline and few arrivals balked at being asked to choose between accepting relocated migrants and paying into the shared fund, turning what Italy called solidarity into a fight over money and capitals that had spent a decade watching this crisis unfold from a comfortable distance. None of that closed the contradiction. It just gave Italy better tools for managing it. Sea arrivals in 2024 fell by more than half from 2023's record, down to roughly 66,000. A drop credited largely to externalization deals with Tunisia and Libya that intercept boats and turn people back before they ever reach Italian waters, letting Rome claim a border success without a single new law passed at home. The 452,000 worker legal migration quota stayed in force the entire time, completely untouched by the falling arrival numbers, because the two systems were never actually solving the same problem. Meloni's approval on migration policy held steady domestically through all of it. Even while courts kept ruling against her Albania model, the EU kept redrawing the rules from Brussels, and mosque disputes in 100 different town halls remained exactly as unresolved as they had been at the start. One door closed, another quietly opened. Italy proved it can choke off a route across open water with money, judges, and offshore camps, but it cannot manufacture the caregivers, farmhands, and construction workers an aging nation needs just to keep functioning day to day. The real border isn't the one patrolled by boats anymore. It's the one drawn between who gets to cross for safety and who gets to cross for work. Which door do you think should decide who gets in? The one guarding against danger or the one guarding the economy? Let us know your take in the comments. And if this kind of story is for you, like and subscribe for more.